it did make sense to have that for a couple of reasons. This week, though, script. We're diverging from the textbook, and I've got a lecture particularly on usability. Now, usability is something which is a core part of the software engineering courses in our undergraduate degree. They spend several weeks on it. We're going to spend one lecture on it, right? Because you have a much more compressed software engineering program than they do, where it's spread over 3 years. Okay. I also want to make it clear that everything in today's lecture is essentially material from Maria Crisvilla Uriel, who is another lecturer here in the department, who's a specialist in this area. So I have done some work with user interfaces and usability issues, but I'm not an expert in this area. Okay? So I understand the issues, but that's about the limit of it. So basically today we're going to look at particularly the issue of measuring usability. So we'll talk about, first of all, what usability is, what usability engineering is, and usability testing, and then how we can evaluate it. So the goals of evaluation and the tools that you would use to evaluate. And it all falls under the general umbrella of something known as human-centered systems design. So designing systems with the idea that there are going to be people using them. And you're designing the systems for the people, not trying to get the people to fit with the systems. Right? So usability is a key pursuit of human-computer interaction. And the original definition, which came from Shackle back in 1990, is that systems should be easy to use, easy to learn, flexible, and essentially make people happy, or at least make them have a positive attitude towards using the system. And there's this idea of packed design, centered around people, activities, contexts, and technologies. So we have these 4 different aspects that all come together. We'll consider them together. So as that design has increased, there's also additional sort of elements such as accessibility. So how do you design for people who might have trouble using standard interfaces, for example? And some people, in the response to the ticketing system last week, did identify that as an issue, right? And also sustainability is increasingly becoming a consideration, right? So you'll see a lot of reports in the newspaper now about, well, 2 sides to Bitcoin, so people and blockchain. And people say that, this is the solution to everything. Some people do. I heard some politician said it was the solution to the Irish border, which seems a bit ridiculous. But you also get this issue that if we got rid of blockchain and Bitcoin from the world, we would see, I think it's a 5% decrease in energy usage overnight. That's how much electricity is required to just maintain those systems. Right? So people are starting to think about issues like that. And, and the fact that if you're building cloud services and you have a data center, putting your data center near the energy source, particularly near a renewable energy source, makes sense because then you don't have to worry about power transmission and things like that. So there's, people are starting to think about these things. So the goals of usability are usually concerned with efficiency, so how well can you get things done, how cheaply can you get things done, and that sort of thing, and effectiveness. To what extent do we actually achieve what we want to do. So accessibility, as we said, is that thing that we would want to remove all the barriers that would otherwise exclude some people from using the system at all. So for example, if you're doing web-based design, always including alternatives for images where they are an essential element of the page, so that somebody with a text reader, so with low vision, where they just get something to read it out to them, it will read out the text alternative to the image so that they don't lose information. Now, of course, if you have a pretty image as the background to your web page that is just making it look pretty and is not conveying any information, you don't need to put that information in. But that's the kind of idea of it. So usability has a number of different things that we can measure. So you can have the quality of the interaction, where you talk about like the time taken to perform tasks, the number of errors that a person typically makes, the time it takes to become a competent user. But the system needs to be accessible before it's usable. Because if you design usability around a particular set of systems, I'm going to close the door because otherwise we're going to get the other class drowning us out. If you design a system to be usable and then worry about accessibility, you'll probably find that you've designed your usability around your typical user, and it makes it very difficult to accommodate your atypical users, right? So always think about those people right from the start, people who might be vision impaired, who might be audio impaired, who might have motor impairment, so you can't put buttons too close together, that type of thing. And then work on the usability. So you might also have the situation where, by some criteria, in particular time taken to perform tasks and the numbers of errors made, and even the time to become a competent user, it's a very successful system. But it can still fail to satisfy your users. They just don't like using it. Right? And so that's a harder thing to measure, is the user satisfaction aspect of it. And that's kind of where acceptability comes in. So acceptability is fitness for purpose in the context of use. Right? So usability can be measured in a lab. And you can set up a lab with your system and get people to come in and test it, and you can do the tests and you can see how well they perform doing things, and have some usability measures. But acceptability is real world use. So what happens when you go back and install it in their office or in their home or wherever they're going to use it? Is it going to fit into that environment and in the way they do other things as well in that environment? Because a lab is a really controlled experiment, and in the real world, they're unlikely to be doing this thing in isolation. There's going to be other things going on around them, other things that they have to pay attention to, and will it fit into that bigger workflow? And acceptability is really where these sort of personal preferences come in, about individual quirks that make people like to use a particular interface or not. Yeah, I've done that thing again where I've talked a lot about what's on the next slide before I've got to it. So some examples of how acceptability fits technologies into the real world is that, so for example, some railway trains have quiet carriages where you're not meant to use your mobile phone or listen to music or that type of thing. cinemas, before the film, they have that little thing where they tell you to turn off your mobile, remind you to turn off your mobile phone, or I have at the start of a lecture. So they're kind of examples of how we use technology every day, but still there are some ways in which it isn't acceptable to use it in the modern world, and we adapt our practices to make it acceptable. Okay, so everybody carries the mobile phone around with them. You almost certainly take it to the cinema with you, and you would almost automatically turn it off, but you might forget, and so it gives you that reminder to turn off your mobile phone. I don't know how many people remember the Apple iMac computer. It was the first personal computer that was designed to look good. Okay, before that, they were ugly boxes, right? Much the same as the ones are in the labs here, if you like. But the point is, it was meant to be like a design statement in people's living room. Okay, so there was a recognition that people were more and more commonly bringing the computer into the main part of the house. It wasn't sitting away in some office room somewhere. It was being part of the family space, and so you wanted to have a style statement about it. And in order to make that acceptable, you didn't want an ugly beige box sitting in the corner. So they weren't even black at that point. They were those horrible beige things, and they really did look ugly. You can see with the Amazon things, they've very nicely, it's got dinner with Emma. I don't know why that is. Just happened to choose my name. I didn't put that image up there. Maria did before I even joined the department. Anyway, they're designed to be stylish, okay? And they started off with these black tower things, and now they're getting furry covers, and you can get different covers for them in the same way you can get different covers for your mobile phones. But design is coming into it in order to make it acceptable to have these in the home. Okay, so let's look at an example of some usability and acceptability kind of things. In particular, looking at Google versus Yahoo. So these two, back in the noughties, were the battle of the search engines. And it's pretty obvious which one won. But Yahoo as a search engine was big before Google was. Right? And back in 2006, this is what Yahoo search looked like. So if you went to Yahoo to do a search, you got that search box up the top, and you got all this stuff all around it, right? So that's in 2006. And in Google, at the same time, looked like that, right? So you can see they had the same functionality, right? So they did the same thing, but I would argue that a big reason for the success of Google over Yahoo, because Yahoo was well ahead in the market at that point, was this nice clean interface. So design came into it. So a system with a high degree of usability will be efficient, in that people can do things with a minimal amount of effort. So you don't have to click through 10 links to find the information that you want, for example. It'll be effective in that it's making the best use of the tools that are available and organising it in an appropriate way. It'll be easy to learn. That might mean building upon existing usage patterns in similar types of interfaces or something like that, or just it might introduce a whole new workflow because there's been a lot of thought put into the best way to have the workflow for this problem. It is going to depend upon what you're doing. It needs to be safe. Okay, so if it's something for children, a web search engine for children, for example, you don't want them stumbling on inappropriate content, that kind of thing. And it has to have high utility. So you want to do the things that people want to get done. Don't try to constrain it to something really narrow if it's obvious that doing something just a little bit more will give you a massive increase in the utility for the user. Okay, so they're kind of the defining points of what usability is. Given that, we also want the idea that we want to be able to measure certain things about usability. So we have issues like with learnability, how quickly can you learn to use the software? You know, is it going to take you an hour, a day, a week, a month? And those times, well, it's going to depend upon what the system is, what's appropriate. Okay? If it's a search engine, you want to learn how to use it in 5 minutes. Right? If it's complex accounting system, you probably want at least a week, maybe even a month, depending upon the degree of complexity of the functions of it and everything, and what you're going to be using it for. So it's really going to be context dependent. Again, I apologise for I think I've gone here on the angle here, it's difficult to read this. This one says efficiency. How quickly can you perform your tasks? Okay, so you don't want to be wasting time while you're doing what you want to do. Satisfaction. How much do you enjoy using the software? Okay, now that's a difficult one to measure, but it is an important measure. Okay, sometimes you would be saying, to what degree does it annoy you? Because how often have you used a software system where it's just frustrating to use? Or a mechanical software system or something like that, one of those kiosk type things where it's just doesn't quite work the way you're expecting it to. Memorability. That's an interesting one because it's related to learnability, but it's how quickly can you remember how to use your software. So once I've had the training, do I have to use it every day to remember how to do those things? Or can I learn how to do it and then come back to it a month later, and because it was so intuitive when I learned how to do it, I just remember how to do it. I know when I'm using the student admin system, when I started at the university, I went on a whole range of courses and learned how to do lots and lots of things. But most of those things you don't do very often. It might be once a semester or something like that. And every time I have to do those things once a semester, I have to pull out the training sheet again because it's not memorable at all. And in fact, in many cases, the things that you have to do are counterintuitive and you can't just, you can't remember at all. And errors. How often do you encounter errors in the software? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean bugs, but it might mean bugs. But just things where you do what you think is a logical course of action and you don't get the results that you would expect. Right. So when we're talking about usability, we're measuring user experience, right? And usability engineering basically wants you to turn specific usability measures into requirements in your system specification. Okay? So we talk about usability attributes or principles, the concept of measuring them, the method of measuring them, and we tend to talk about what the system's like now, what the worst case can be, what we're planning for, and what the best case would be. Okay, so the best case is like the golden holy grail, where you want to get to. but we acknowledge that in many cases we're not going to be able to get quite there, so we talk about where we're getting to, right? We also do tend to talk about the worst case, because we want to avoid the worst case. We talk about the current level, because we want to make sure that we improve on the current level and we don't get worse than the current level, right? So if we're doing a system redesign, we want to at least be as good as the current system, not worse. Now that seems intuitive, but you'd be surprised how often, particularly when people are going from a manual or semi-manual, paper-based system into a computer-based system, it becomes worse and more onerous on the user. So the problems that we encounter when we're doing this is that usability specification requires a level of detail that's quite often difficult in early design, because in the early design you're talking at the sort of conceptual overview sort of view of the system, whereas usability really depends upon what your user interface is going to look like and that sort of thing, so it's quite a low-level thing. And more awkward is that satisfying a usability specification doesn't necessarily satisfy usability. Why would that be?
Well, maybe because usability specification wasn't specified well.
Yeah, even if the usability thing is specified well, it's difficult to capture every aspect of. So you can capture certain characteristics, but all of those things in isolation, while they're important, it's the whole interaction of all the different things that really make the system in terms of usability. Okay, because you will define your usability specification in terms of specific aspects about, you need to be able to learn it in a week, or the user shouldn't have to click more than 3 clicks to get the piece of information that they want. And they're very sort of specific measures which are sensible, but it doesn't capture that big picture of usability. And you just can't capture that big picture of usability. There's no real way of doing it within usability engineering. So we're measuring specifics in usability engineering and putting, constraints on specific parameters of usability, but that doesn't say how the whole interacts with each other, all the bits of it. Okay, so here is a usability specification for a DVD recorder. And what we want to be able to do is basically go back. We want to be able to undo an erroneous programming sequence, and we want to be able to count how many actions it takes to undo the current program. The now level is, well, there is no such feature currently. Right? The worst case should be exactly the number of instructions it took to get to that erroneous state. So basically undoing your instructions one by one. So if I took 10 steps to get to this point, and it was that 10th thing back there that was the root of the problem, then if I undo each of those things in turn, then that's my worst case. The best case would be undo and be back to that 10 steps ago point, right? And the planned level here, they've said we want a maximum of 2 explicit user actions. Okay, now this might or might not, maybe it's not even possible, but it's an example of the type of thing that you might want to do, right? So we're going to what we're caring about is how many steps it takes to erase a mistake. And you're saying, I guess the worst case is undo every single step that it took to get to that point. And we want somehow to be able to go back to explicit user actions. So maybe you would have something like a find problem, revert to that point, or something like that, right? I'm not saying that it's achievable, okay, but just conceptually, this is the type of thing that you would be doing. So when we're designing for usability, we should always be thinking about evaluation. How are we going to be evaluating it? What sort of evaluation is going to be performed? And in order to do that, we are linking 3 separate areas where we put the vision for the system, the understanding of how it's going to work in a given context and that sort of thing, and then the design, both at the conceptual level, so what sorts of things is it going to do, and the physical level, or the interface level. Not, I mean, if we're talking about a computer thing, physical's not quite right, but the actual interface that somebody's going to interact with. So again, we're talking about software engineering processes. This looks very much like a waterfall model, right? Except that it's got a lot more backflow arrows than we're used to seeing. But it still is essentially a waterfall model. This one is a more cyclical one, more like agile processing, where it's a constant evolving thing, which there is no starting point. In particular, you can sort of, there's a sense in which you can jump in at any point. It doesn't really work that way. I mean, you could start in at coding the program without really thinking about the design and mock up something and then document, test it, see what happens. So, you know, you could, if you started with coding, essentially what you would be doing is starting with a prototype. And in some design processes, that is what happens. They say, here's what you want, very rough idea of what you want. Does this sort of design fit with your vision of the thing? And then you actually implement it at some level, very rough implementation, give it to the user goes, yeah, that kind of is what we want to do, but we'd really like that, and you know, and so you have that iterative process going on. Okay, so with these cyclical ones, the idea is, in a sense, that you could jump in at any point, but there are some points that are better to jump in at than others, right? And it's going to depend upon whether you're starting from scratch, okay? Because if you're starting from scratch, you're probably going to be starting around the analyze point. But if you're modifying an existing system, you might be starting somewhere around about here, where you've got some documentation that you're working from, and you're looking at the existing system and then moving on from there. Or you might have a system that doesn't have any documentation for one reason or another, you know, a very old legacy one, which somewhere along the line the documentation got lost. So you're starting off at this point and you're having to generate the documentation yourself, right? But it kind of, it does depend upon your situation. Okay, so when we're talking about usability testing though, we're generally wanting to get representative users attempting representative tasks in representative environments. So essentially, we need these 3 elements. We need a set of users to do the testing, an environment, and remember we're talking about a lab-based environment here, so it's not the environment that they would usually be working in, but we want to simulate some elements of the environment that they would usually be working in. And some typical tasks that they would do in this system, right? So it's the same sort of thing. Sometimes when you go for a job interview, you get told to do something that would be typical of a activity in a normal day of that task. So when I did my job interview, I had to give a mini lecture, as if I was delivering a particular topic to first year students. When the admin staff come to have interviews in the office, they have to do something to do with manipulating student data on the system. And, you know, so that they're not real tasks, so I didn't have to give a real lecture to real first year students. I had a fake audience of other lecturers. When the admin people come in and they manipulate student data, it's not real student data, it's dummy student data, but it's representative of the typical tasks that whatever that person is being interviewed for. Usability testing is the same type of thing. So there are different ways of doing it. You can have paper prototypes. Okay, so just draw on paper and get them to show how they would use the interface on the paper. Screen mock-ups, where it's been done with Photoshop or something like that, so that they know what the layout of the different screens are. Prototypes controlled by Wizard of Oz. What's that? What's a Wizard of Oz experiment? Anyone know? Okay. Talk a bit more about it later in the lecture, but essentially it's where you have a system that's meant to be a computer-controlled system, but actually what you've got is a person sitting in the next room who's changing the computer interface as if it was driven by a computer. So the whole back end to the system hasn't been implemented. Somebody's just pretending that it's been done, right? And if what you're interested in is this the right interface before we go and build and do all the code for the back end, it could be a very sensible way of doing it, because your code for the back end might be different if your front end interface is different. So if you're focusing on designing your front end, you don't want to put a lot of effort into the back end yet. So you have somebody pretending to be that back end. You might have partially functional software. So you might be focusing on a little bit of the user interface and you just implement just enough to get that bit of the user interface working. Or it could be all the way up to fully working versions of the software. Okay, particularly in the later stages of development, it's quite likely to be the fully working versions of the software. And the aim of usability testing is to improve the quality of the interface by finding flaws to fix it, and as soon as possible. Okay? And that's why we have all these different types of testing, from paper prototypes right up to fully working versions of the software. Because if you can find a problem back at this stage when you've just drawn up pictures on paper, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to fix it than to fix it in the fully working version of the software. So one question that sometimes comes up is whether usability testing is research in the academic research sense. The answer is there are similarities in terms of the methods that are used. Okay, so we have measures of task performance and time performance. We use surveys of user satisfaction, observation techniques from ethnography. Remember when we were talking about the requirements gathering? Some of these techniques here are coming up again, right? Now, these sorts of things can be used in traditional research as well, but the differences appear because the end goals are usually different. So, usability testing is an industry approach. Okay? Our aim isn't to get results that can be published in research, it is to improve the user interface design. It's very much focused on practical applications rather than developing any theory out of it. And the biggest concern is building a successful product in the shortest possible time with the fewest resources while minimizing risks. Okay, so it's all about making an efficient business process. Now, when it comes to usability, there are standards. Okay, so many of you will have heard of the International Organization for Standardization, right? The reason that many of you will have heard of it is that it has applications in many different areas. Okay, so you're all from different backgrounds, and some of you will have used it in whatever context you've been working in, right? So it provides requirements, specifications, guidelines, characteristics to consistently ensure that materials or products or processes or services are fit for purpose. So it can talk about the quality of steel, for example, or the analysis technique for a biological sample, or I don't know, all sorts of things really. Anything under the sun pretty well. There is also a British Standards Institution, which is the recognised UK national standards body, and there'll be other national standards bodies around the world that will have more localised versions specific to the particular national context. Okay, so the ISO organisation has 162 national standard bodies which are members of it. So all of those national standard bodies feed into the International Standards Organisation. More than nearly 22,000 different standards, and the top 3 are on quality management, which is very broad, right? Environmental management, okay, again, covers a huge range of things, and information security management. Right? So standards about protecting data and that sort of thing. The one we're interested in is ISO 9241, which is known as the ergonomics of human-system interaction. And it adopts these traditional usability categories such as effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. Originally, it was the ergonomic requirements for office work with visual display terminals, but it's broadened beyond that, right? So it doesn't just apply to office work anymore, and it might be interfaces that don't involve visual display terminals in the traditional sense. So we have things like, in terms of the suitability of the task, they talk about percentage of goals achieved, the time to complete a task, and a rating scale for satisfaction. Learnability, percentage of functions learned, time to learn, and the ease of learning. So you get the idea about the different types of things that it is talking about in terms of the measurements. Okay, now, most of you aren't going to be deeply concerned with complying to standards. How many of you in your previous whatever you were doing did have to worry about ISO standards? Right? That's despite the fact that some of you were nodding because you recognised them. Okay? In most situations, the ISO standards are like the golden chalice, what you're aiming for, right? And I see, like for example, in final year projects, when people are talking about their user specifications for their final year projects, not so much about usability standards, but about data security standards, for example, they will talk about complying to ISO standard, whatever the number was for data security. It's really tough to guarantee compliance to an ISO standard, okay? So you might want to aim towards that standard, but to say that you're going to comply with it is a really, really big ask, okay? So think about looking at the standards in terms of where you want to aim, and in some situations you will be in a situation where you want to have compliance with a standard. but more often it's going to be, you're going to be working towards the standard.
How much the percentages should be for these standards, and how can we measure the satisfaction?
Okay, so the next half of the lecture is on evaluation. So I think these questions, so ask me again at the end of the lecture if they're not answered in this part, but yeah, you prompted me to the next slide. Okay, so question was, so what percentages should we have for those things, and how do we measure something like user satisfaction? Right. Well, let's first of all talk about why we want to evaluate, right? And essentially, if you don't have user testing as part of your development cycle, you're going to be throwing away stacks of money, because if you produce a product which isn't acceptable to the users in terms of usability, they ain't going to buy it, right? So you want to involve them in that process, particularly when you're in a competitive market, which pretty well all software development is. You want to make sure that the usability is there right from the start. It's much easier to do it early. So when we're evaluating, we want to assess how functional the system is. We want to assess how the interface affects the user, and we want to identify any specific problems that need addressing. And there are lots of different ways that you can do evaluation. You can do some automated testing. You can test involving users in controlled settings, and they're typically usability testing in laboratory experiments, sometimes in living labs. Living labs are kind of laboratory spaces which are made to look as much like a real world situation as possible, right? In natural settings, doing field studies, seeing how people use them in their workplace, in their home, that type of thing. Or you can do testing that doesn't involve users. And so in some sense you get experts that critique or predict or analyse, model different aspects of the user interface. They do things like a cognitive walkthrough, which is sort of talking through the reasoning process that somebody would be using as they used an interface. They might use some sort of heuristic evaluation. So heuristic is basically rule of thumb, right? Where you just say, this is the type of thing that we want out of it, without having anything really concrete to measure. You might have a review-based evaluation, where you look at what people have said about how they use it. Or you might have a model-based evaluation, where you are modelling the users. You could have a computational model of the users, and this is where my work in usability testing is done. I've done work in cognitive science, where we were looking at the design of different interfaces and how they get distracted with, say, in-car hands-free telephones in cars. So once upon a time, it used to be considered, you know, if you were using your phone in your hand in the car, that was a bad thing, and it's a bad thing now, right? But it was regarded that if you had it in a cradle and you weren't actually physically interacting with it, then it was fine. Well, it's actually quite easy to show that you get highly distracted even when it's in a cradle and you're interacting. It's distracting you from the road. Your attention has to be when you're having a conversation, when you're asking it to dial a number or that sort of thing. All of those things distract you from the primary purpose quite significantly. So I am very against any form of telephone usage by drivers in cars, whether it's hands-free or not. Okay, so we can have controlled settings, natural settings, or without users. And we can have lots of different methods here, either observing people, asking users, asking experts, formal usability testing, or formal modelling, right? And they sort of fall into a matrix like that. So that's another way of looking at the points that I had on the previous slide. Okay, so automated usability testing is basically using software to compare to interface guidelines. And it's useful particularly where you want to compare lots of different possible interfaces in a short amount of time. You can use metrics because it's all automated. You can measure things, so you can look at the number of fonts, the average size of fonts, the average size of buttons, the loading time of graphics. It might be useful if you're looking at how accessible websites are for people with disabilities. So checking that all of the images that are important conveyors of information have alt text things, that type of thing. But it can't check everything. So you can't check whether the wording is appropriate in the instructions, for example, or if the layout is appropriate. You can have some heuristics that check the layout for you, but sometimes it needs an actual human viewer to look at the layout in order to detect problems. So, big bonus is quick, right? But there's lots of aspects of usability that can't be tested by automated methods. Okay? So all of those things that sort of have cognitive elements to them, it's very difficult to automate. Okay, I've done some work in that area, but it was very limited. Okay, so now let's look at usability testing. And essentially you get real users involved. You give the users real tasks to accomplish. And the testers usually observe and record the actions of the participants. And then the testers analyse the recordings that they've got and make changes accordingly. Right? So that's very general. There are lots of different ways that you can actually do that. So one popular way is for people to, when they're observing and recording the actions of the participants, if you're just watching what they do, you've only got a tiny fraction of the story. So sometimes people say, let's use a speak aloud protocol. And so the users are encouraged to talk through the reasoning that they're using in order to do whatever they're doing. So if you see somebody using a user interface and they're just sort of randomly pulling down the menus, you don't know why that is. And then if they say, I'm looking for the menu option that will let me add an image, for example, all of a sudden it becomes clear what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, not just what they're doing. Right? So in terms of the user-based testing, so we might use paper prototypes or the Wizard of Oz protocol that I was talking about earlier. You might be looking at how the user is perceiving the prototype. So they might be saying, yeah, I think it's really good that this part of the information is really prominent in the middle of the screen, but where do I find the information about that? And you say, oh, it's that bit down there. And they say, well, no, it needs to be more prominent than that. So it gives you sort of some feeling about your initial design for the layout of the interface. And it has the benefit that when users see it in that very primitive form, they're more likely to give you feedback because they think, oh, well, you know, you haven't actually built anything yet, so it's not going to cost you anything to make it more like what I want. Once they start seeing software that you've developed, they have a sense that, oh, you've already invested so much time in this, it's going to cost a lot if I want to change it now, even if that's not actually true. So their perceptions about things might influence the feedback that they give you. We have summative tests where you're talking about high-level design choices and evaluating the effectiveness of choices. So you might be comparing two different interfaces, for example, and getting the users to rank two different interfaces, saying, yeah, I prefer it when it's done that way to this way. And you might do some sort of benchmarking where you're getting the user to compare to existing interfaces or similar ways of solving the problem. Okay, almost always you have video recordings in these situations. Sometimes it's down to the level of logging mouse movements and key presses. Sometimes it's just audio which is somehow synced with the user interface, but it's much easier doing it with video as well, because then you don't have to worry about the syncing problem. You can see what's on the video interface. And that data can be used to calculate performance times and to identify and explain errors. And it's often this second point, which is the most important one. You see when users are, when you've intended the user to do one particular thing and they just, it's not intuitive to them, so they've tried to do it a different way. Okay, so it makes it very easy to pinpoint those particular types of things. In terms of user satisfaction, that's a qualitative measure, a very subjective one as well, okay, because different users are going to have different things that make them satisfied with a particular interface, but generally you do it either with questionnaires or with interviews or both, right? So you might have a questionnaire that's got a whole lot of Likert scale questions from 1 to 5, saying different aspects of the user interface, and then a scale of strongly disliked to strongly liked kind of thing. Or just a more open-ended interview where you're asking them to say, you know, what aspects of the user interface worked well for you? How happy were you doing this particular task? Right? But it's always going to be very subjective, the things that you get back. And so again, you need a representative set of users. It's not enough to test it against one user, because one user is not going to be typical. Right? So a bit light relieved. Here is the developer watching a videotape of a usability test, and he's going, no, that's not how you're supposed to use it. Right? And, you know, that's the developer's fault, is the point. The developer has designed it such that it's not intuitive for the user how they're supposed to use it. So the developer shouldn't be acting frustrated like that. He should be saying, I did something wrong, what do I need to change? I'm going to skip the video.
Expect your mobile app to get great reviews and drive conversions through the
Maybe you
roof.
can.
With our mobile app solution, test with users in the wild and validate your app's usability and design, getting the insights you need to generate the best experience possible. Let's see it in action. Invite real users who are already using your app on their own devices to remotely participate in your studies via an invitation layer, or simply send out an invitation link via email, guiding targeted users to take the study within your app. After they agree to participate, you can ask a few preliminary questions, like their age or gender, or even behavioral questions like how often they go to the movies. Since we're testing the usability of your app, users are given instructions to complete a task of your choosing. Our mobile app solution offers a layer that can be easily moved around, minimized, or maximized, reminding users of the instructions during any time of the task. In this case, the user is asked to find a button that allows them to watch a movie trailer. After users have completed a task, they are given a validation question to ensure that they've completed the task successfully. After validation, you can then ask users a series of follow-up questions about their experience, and the study is complete. Now that you've seen the process, let's see the results. With users, you can get highly actionable data that is collected in real time and neatly displayed in an intuitive dashboard. Get quantitative UX metrics like survey responses, success rates overall and per task, ease of use, satisfaction ratios, Net Promoter Score, click paths, and screen recordings, which can be enabled or disabled for all or any tasks in a study setup. Our videos are easy to filter out and sort through, and you don't have to watch every single video to add qualitative data to your existing quantitative metrics. What's even better is that you can export all of this data and easily share it with your development team to make confident, data-driven decisions together. Want to close